And welcome back to another exciting Blender tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at how to bake materials for Eevee and then how to get those materials into Unreal to get them working. Let's jump into it. Now, baking a material is kind of it's a little bit weird, all right? Not too weird, just a little weird. So I'll show you how it works. Let's bring this down. Okay, first thing we want to do is with our object selected, make sure we've got our hologram texture, the texture that we want to bake. And the first thing you always have to do to make it work is you need to add a node into your shader graph for this material called an image node, image texture node, sorry. So here's an image texture mode. Now, usually you bring these in when you're bringing in an image texture that you want to pipe into your object, into your shader, right? But in this particular case, when you're baking out, you actually have to have one in here. And that sort of tells Blender, okay, what are we saving? What's the file name going to be called? How's it going to work? This is sort of like now treated like the output directory. Now, you don't have to plug this into anything. You just have to sit it inside the shader. So it's very unintuitive, but just go with it. It's the way things work. Okay, so first thing we do is we click on New, and now we can give this one a name. Let's call this hologram building. Again, we want to name it something specific, even though we're using this hologram texture on a few objects in our scene, like this in the little table. We have different UV layouts for both of these. So this baking out this texture is going to look different for both of these objects. So instead of having one material for both of them, we actually need two materials now. So this doubles things up a little bit. And let's also make it a bit bigger. So I'm going to go for, I'm actually going to go for a 4K texture. So I'm going to multiply it by 4 for both of these. I don't need an alpha channel, even though we're working with the alpha for our noise, but I'll explain that in a minute. So I'm just going to turn that off. And I'm going to turn on 32-bit float, okay? And I'm going to click OK. Make sure the color space is set to linear. That's just going to give us the most color data and the most information possible, and that's what Unreal needs. It needs linear color space for texture images. And now what we can do is we don't have to do anything else with that. We can leave it. Now we have to switch over to cycles. This is the next step. So you can't do this out of Eevee. You got to go to cycles. I'm going to switch to GPU compute, and I'm going to take my samples down to 50. That's probably about all we're going to need. You'll need to you can test that out to get the right kind of quality. And I'm just going to come down to this little tab, Bake. Now, baking out the material, you've got a bunch of different options. You could talk about the bake type. These all correspond to what is it you want to bake out. Over here on our principal BSDF, we've got a lot of different nodes, right? So we could bake out any one of these, right? You'll notice that they aren't all listed, but that's all right. I can explain that in a minute. So we could bake out our roughness, for example. In our case, we want to be using the alpha. So let's see. Oh, wait, there's no alpha. So how do you handle this when you don't actually have the channel you want? Well, as a little trick, you can actually make sure you get really consistent results. And I like to do this because it gives me the same result. I know what I'm getting. It works really well. Is to actually take my alpha channel or whatever channel it is that I want that's not listed and pipe it into the emission temporarily. Okay. And then go to here and select emit. So now it's going to bake out whatever's piped into the emission node. And this is just a black and white value, right? This little noise system that we have was just a black and white system that's driving the alpha channel, which only takes a black and white system. So any of these, it's just a single number. All they take is a black and white value, 1 to 0. What do you want? What's the texture look like? They don't take in color information. So only our base color, subsurface color, the emission, I'm sure there's some other ones, but they're the main ones, right? These are the only ones that really take in color. They need red, green, and blue. So that's 3 numbers, right? We only need black and white for these. So it works to just pipe this into the emission. Now, emission is red, green, and blue as well. But again, we're just going to get out an image that's black and white because that's what this is. Just telling you about what you should expect to see when you do it. Okay, so we set emit, and that's pretty much all we need to worry about is that. Now, one thing I forgot was if you have a subdivision surface modifier applied to your object, which I don't, and you're unwrapping your UVs, you need to make sure that you take that into account. So when you go to your UV unwrap up here, you get a little drop-down menu, and use subsurface modifier is an option that's ticked, okay? And you want to make sure that you tick that. All right, I'll just make sure I didn't mess up my UVs. Too bad. Oh yeah, I did move them around a little bit, but that's all right. Just undo that. just bear in mind with that. So back to the material tab, back to the rendering tab, sorry. So we're setting to emit, and that's pretty much all we need. Margin is basically how much of an overlap is it going to render past. So if you go to your UVs, it's going to render out a margin. So it's going to let the pixels bleed out. And that's just a safety thing so that, if you're doing, if the doesn't quite line up or something's a bit off, you always have a fill. So you never get like a black line or anything around the edge. Yeah, cool. So that's all you got to do is just pick out which one you want. So the biggest thing is just remembering to put this image node in and switching to cycles. Those are like the two biggest steps. And then it's thinking about what do I want, what channel, and how can I get to it? So I'm going to pipe that into the emission. Now we don't have any other values that we've really changed for this particular one. Another thing that's really helpful is if you take your base color, if in our particular case, we're just using emission to light this object, we're not really using the base color. If I set my base color to my emission, the base color always comes into Unreal. So all these other ones don't, but the base color will. So at least we'll have those RGB values already there and we can grab them and put them into the emission. So that's a worthwhile thing to do as well. So I'll just pipe this in for the emission and we'll click on bake. Now you'll see down here, texture bake will begin and you get this little percentage bar that tells you how much progress it's made. So we'll head over to the image editor and here we are. And this is our texture. You can see it's just black and white and it's exported quite well. We've actually got, a fair amount of resolution here. We've got a bit of aliasing on our little edges here. But overall, it looks pretty good. It's not too shabby. You can see this is the overlap, the margin that it was talking about. So it's going to bled the edge in a bit. So this won't actually show up in the texture. This is just a safety for you. Yeah, overall, I think it looks pretty good. Very important. The next very important thing to remember, whenever you do this, right, we bake out a material, you'll notice something up here next to image is a little asterisk. And also you got this little pop-up that notified us down here, but it's easy to miss. This texture is not saved anywhere. So this is living temporarily in Blender's memory or in the computer's memory under the application of Blender, right? So as soon as we save our file and close our file, close the project, this will be cleared. This will leave memory. So it doesn't stick around. And that can be really disappointing if you're not careful and you bake out a ton of objects and then you get all these things here and then you close your project and then they're all gone. So be sure you always remember to go up here and go save as and save that texture. Give it the name you want and put it in the texture folder you want, but just make sure you're saving it externally so that you don't lose it, okay? Because it's tricky, because it'll appear in your node graph and everything. We can actually just use it right away. So be sure you save this thing. I'm gonna go ahead and save mine. So now that we've baked it out, we can go back to our shader editor and we can make sure that it's selected. So it's actually just already there in the list for us. It fills it out. You can also click on the file here to open it up and make sure it's in there. Now what we can do is we can actually unpipe that from the emission and we can test this thing out. So let's stick our node system back into alpha and go to rendered mode and have a look at what things look like. Okay, I'll switch back to Eevee as well. So let's go from cycles back over to Eevee. All right, so that's what it looks like with our node system and the way it's generating. I'll just get down so we can have a good angle at it. Now I'm gonna switch it over. So I'll pipe this into the alpha. And there we go. So you can see it's changed a little bit. It's gone darker. Now we could just pipe our emission up a little bit more with this material if we wanted to. So you could go to the vibrancy and maybe stick that up to 3 and it's going to look pretty similar. It's not exactly the same, is it? And this is really important to note. You can see if I get close to the object, you can see the aliasing on our edging, right? And you can see where the resolution of the texture might not quite be high enough to get the same crisp look that we had in our generated version, right? That's not using a material texture. So that's the limitations. This is now a 4K texture, which is a really big texture size, really big file that has to be loaded into memory. So this is actually a slower system and it doesn't look as good. It doesn't look as fine as what we had with our generated system. So those are the trade-offs. You have to make sure your UVs are large enough and that they're baked in really well. If we switch over to the UV editor, you can see if I go into edit mode and select all. So again, the size of these guys is really important. So, if like we had before, the polygons were all really small and bunched up, that 4K texture still wouldn't be enough to really take care of it. So you can see we go right in here, these small polygons, these are really large pixels that, are clearly going to show up in the render if we get close enough to them. So that's the trade-off. That's the tricky bit that you got to think through when it comes to stuff like that. And again, of course, we're going to have to do that for each of these different objects now because each one has its own system. So it can take a little while. It can be cumbersome. You may want to save time. And for example, like with the floor, go into your shader editor and just get rid of the noise that we've got. You know, you may just want to go, you know what? It's not worth the time for me. I'm just going to do a roughness of 2.96. And then you can just bring these numbers over into Unreal and enter it in. And it's going to look fine. So maybe think about what are the exact textures that you want that are really important that you really want to bring over. Okay. Now, one quick little gotcha that you got to be aware of that's can snake up on you and be a bit confusing if you don't know how to look for it is that if you've got a situation like this, we've got our hollow table and we've got a bunch of different materials all assigned to it because we've got all these different objects that we've merged in. Now, you may not have merged yours in together yet. This is just something I'm doing to prep to go over. We'll cover this more later on, I think in episode 8 of this series, but you're going to run into a situation at some point where you're going to have an object that you've made a bunch of different things and you've merged them all together into one piece of geometry. And, we've covered UVs and UV layouts and stuff. So you know about overlapping UVs. If I just go into this object and just select everything, you can see that we've got a lot of different overlapping UVs. So if you have overlapping UVs and you try and bake out a material, it's going to not give you the result you want because it's going to end up baking how the material reacts to everything. And since we've got different materials assigned to different objects, if you try and say we've tried to bake out just the door frame metal roughness, it's going to try and bake out door frame metal roughness for all of these UVs, which means all of these buttons, all these objects. It's going to end up saving on an image. It's going to be really pretty much just black because there's no information for this in all these different objects. So it's just a bit. It can be really confusing if you set it all up and, especially if you're just looking at the UVs for that specific bit. So if you go door frame metal, click select, and now you're just looking at these UVs, you think, oh, it looks clean, looks good. And you're going bake and you're getting a result that's not what you want. That's a bit confusing. So what you have to do to make this work is you just got to go to your UVs. I recommend just creating a new UV map just so you keep the old one just in case you need to use it. Switching it by going to the little camera icon. And then what you need to do is in your material tab, just go through all these different materials and deselect everything and select them. Just grab the corresponding UVs for that group. Let's see, I'll find one where we don't have anything selected. Yeah, hollow table base. So we don't need to bake. We don't need any of these UVs to bake out door frame metal. So you can just go over here and hit A and just scale this down and stick it in the corner or something. You can't delete them. You got to keep them, but it's just get them out of the way so that they're not going to be overlapping with the important UVs that you're using. So if we just tuck stuff down in this corner or some of this blank space, it's not going to cause any issues and you'll get the export you're looking for. So just be aware of that and keep an eye out for it. Now, next tip, I'm just going to show you real quick is how to copy UVs. So we've got our building object, right? Our building object is the same as this guy, right? This is just a duplicate of our building object. So we've unwrapped our UVs really nicely here. We might as well use them for our building as well so we can get that noise texture over as well into Unreal. So what we can do is first, if you select the object you want to copy to, and then you select the object you want to copy from, and then hit Control L, which is the make links. You can also get that up here under object. We've got make links right here. You can see Control L is written there as the hotkey system. And then what we want to do is we want to transfer UV maps. So we click that. And now if we open up edit mode for our main object and switch to our UV editor, you'll see that we've got the same UV system that we have on this one. Okay, so that's a great way to copy things over if you have similar objects in your scene. Like these wires, a lot of these are just duplicated. If you wanted to UV unwrap these wires, why you would want to do that, I have no idea. But if you did, on a whim, you were feeling bored, whatever, you wanted to waste 7 hours of your life, you could just copy those over. So, all right, so let's bake out the noise that we have on this one because this is another great example. All right, so I'm gonna switch to my shader, and so let's have a look at this thing and think about what we have to do. This object has a really nice noise pattern on it. You can see I'll get really close. See how close I can get to it when it's generated, and I'm not using a texture because it's all being calculated in engine, right? But we want to bake this thing out, right? So we can get it over into Unreal because we don't want to be bothered making a noise system in Unreal 2. We probably should be bothered, but for teaching purposes, we can't be bothered. Okay, so we need to get our normal out. Now, normals are a little bit different. This process is still somewhat the same. So let's go ahead and do the same steps. So first up, what's the first step? Can you remember? That's right, image texture. We're gonna go ahead and name this our room normal. And I'll keep it 4K because this is, again, such a big object. We're gonna need all the resolution we get. We should probably even go higher with this one, but I'm not. So 32-bit float and alpha turned off. That's great. Great. That step's done. Next step, cycles. Jump over to cycles. All right, now we can come down to bake, and we need to think about where we want to put this thing. Now, normal is not a black and white value, okay? So it's not just straight up 0 and 1. You can see here, if I pipe it into the emission, we get all these vibrant colors. It's a pretty wild, bright, colorful thing, a normal. So basically, every color is representing a different direction. So where the pixel is facing, you get shaded a certain color. And that's how the computer knows how to calculate the lighting. As light hits the object, you can look at this normal and go, oh, okay, well, this pixel's purple, so it's facing this way, so I should shade it like this because there's a light up here. It makes perfect sense. So we need to get all of this information out. Okay, so there's a couple of things we need to do that well. So now, technically speaking, I'm pretty sure you can just leave the color space as linear because a linear color is like not really edited. Like it's sort of it's just what it is. But we should move this to non-color. I haven't done the research to really go super deep and like, does this actually change how the file type is saved other than like flagging it with some kind of meta tag? I don't know. But anyways, if you remember to do it, just try and switch your normals when you're baking them out to non-color. And you can see in the drop-down explanation, it actually says used for bumps and stuff. So, all right, so I'll pipe it back in the normals because we're not actually going to bake this out of emission. We actually get normal as a drop-down option. So let's find that. So there it is, normal. So we're going to switch our bake type to normal. Now we get this new set of options here for the normal that you don't see with like, other stuff. You go to any of these, you're not going to see any extra options. You go to normal, bam, suddenly we got to make some decisions. What does this mean? So basically it's asking us, what's the space for the normals? So there's different types of normals. We're going to leave this set to tangent. And we can leave all this stuff as well, but except for green. So Unreal needs to have -y in the green. So that's just something you have to remember, okay? I'm pretty sure when you import a texture, you get an option on Unreal to set it to reverse the Y channel, reverse the green channel. So there are ways around it, like, but if you remember it up front, it's nice to just kind of say, look, I'm going to Unreal. I'm just going to get this thing ready for Unreal. So this is just flipped from Blender. That's the only difference. So basically the green color, whenever it sees green, it thinks that it's positive Y if we're in Blender. And then if we're in Unreal, it thinks it's negative Y. So that's just remember to do that. So anyway, so now we can just bake this out now that we've set that. Okay, so let's hit bake. Okay, so it's finished. You can see here, baking map saved to internal image, save it externally. Boom, disappears before you can even finish reading it. That's your only warning that you got to save your image. Yikes. So, okay, also, this is also tricky. You can see here that I don't have it up here and I don't have a little asterisk. So there's so many reasons why you could forget this. Anyways, let's go to render result. It's not going to be there either. We got to go to room normal. So we find the actual name. So here it is. Here's our room normal. And you can see there it is. We've got our bump texture and you can see it's very pixely, right? And that's because this is such a small bump map. This is super small, the detail in this, that even a 4K texture with such a clean UV layout is still just going to kind of give us pixels. Now there is some definition to these bumps. You can kind of see a little bit, but I'll pipe it in and I'll show you, what kind of result we get with this. But first I'm going to save it. Okay. Don't forget to save it. All right. So now what I'm going to do is switch back over to Eevee and I'm going to go back to my shader editor. And I've got room normal already selected here, and I've got it set to non-color. Now, first gotcha is that you can't just pipe this straight into the normal. Okay, if you do that, it's going to look like this. And you can tell, probably, hopefully, that this is not the correct result. And what's going on with that? Well, it's because we actually need to have another node, an intermediary node that interprets things. Okay, so let's grab the normal map node. Okay, the normal map mode will now take the non-color information of our normal map texture and convert it so that it will work as a normal. So now if I plug it in, hey, we're going to get normal. Now you can see I can still kind of make out that texture, right? Even though it looked like just pixels, Blender's doing a pretty good job of interpreting it, right? So it doesn't look as good as this, as sharp as this. It's much duller, but still it's there. and it's working. Now, one thing that isn't working, of course, is in this particular one, the Y is reversed. And so this isn't giving us exactly a correct result. If you want to use a texture that has the Y reversed, so you want to have like the same setup in Unreal and in Blender, you just need to do this. You need to separate your RGB first. Okay. Get rid of that. And then we just need to go get a combine RGB. And then we can just bring the red over straight across, the blue straight across, and then we need to get an invert node and just send the green one through the invert node. And so that will just invert the green, make it Y positive. So now if we plug it in, that technically is the correct look. So I can just switch between the two and you can see the difference. So, you know, it's a compromise. It's not as good, but hey, this texture is so small. If I just zoom back, right? It's not really going to matter all that much. Great. So we've got both of those together. Now, the last tip I'll give you just in terms of baking things out is that if you run into a scenario where you've got an object, so let's take this base object thing, the button-based metal texture. Let's say that we've got a noise generator that's going into. So let me see. I'll just grab. I'll grab the noise system that we had over here. So let's say we've got this noise system. Get rid of the bump. So I've got this complicated noise system that's going into my metallic and my specular and my roughness, right? You know, and let's say even more complicated, it's 3 separate systems, you know, for each one. So I've got 3 separate noise systems, let's say, all feeding into this one material, and they're just, this one's driving metallic, this one's driving specular, this one's driving roughness, and I want to bake out a material. This texture, you don't have to actually bake out each of these as a separate texture file because metallic, specular, and roughness are those, like I was saying before, they're just black and white values. You can actually harness the fact that these other channels like base color and emission are using lots of different, are using 3 color channels, RG and B. You can actually pipe 3, because in RGB, like they're just 0 to 1 values as well, right? So red's just 0 to 1, green's just 0 to 1. So you can actually pipe these in to the RG and B channels for something like the emission and save it out as your, you know, your metallic, your specular, and your roughness, right? So what you can do is you can go combine, where is it? Combine RGB again. And then you can just say, all right, I'm going to stick this one into the blue channel. I'll stick this one into the green channel, and I'll stick this one into the red channel. And I'll send all of those into the emission, and then I'll bake out the emission. You'll get this crazy color image, but when you're in Unreal, you can then take it and separate the RG and B channels of that particular texture. And then just remember, okay, that's right. So red was metallic. You can put it in your naming as well for the file. So you can name it metallic roughness, metallic specular roughness, like put it in that order so that you know you can repipe it in at that order. And that's a great way to be more efficient. So you can have one texture that has 3 different channels in it. You also have the alpha channel. If you decide to have an alpha channel, you could use that one as well, because again, that's just a 0 and 1 value. So if you separate out the alpha, then you can treat the alpha as color information or just straight up, you know, data for one of these other shaders. So one last thing that's a good kind of thing to be aware of, it's sort of a gotcha for me that I've noticed, is with base color. Sometimes when you're baking out the base color, to get the colors exactly right so that they match perfectly between Blender and Unreal, I actually tend to bake out my base color out of emission as well. So if I've got a complicated node system that's feeding into my base color, I won't bake out from the baking list. I won't bake out base color. I won't bake out the diffuse. What I'll do is I'll pipe it into the emission. I just like using the emission because it's just purely whatever the color is that's coming in here. It just saves it straight out. It doesn't affect it in any way. And it gives you sort of, you know, just a really clean result. So if you're saving that as a linear image for your colors, then you're going to get the same result over in Unreal. So that's how we do it. That's the long and short of baking out materials. You can see it actually takes a while. Now, as a side note, there's a lot of add-ons for Blender that people have made that speed this process up. You can bake out things a lot quicker using specific add-ons. A lot of them actually cost a bit of money, but they're really good. And if you're doing this a lot, it's probably worth the investment to put the $15 down have a node a button that's going to allow you to quickly bake out a ton of different materials and stuff quickly and easily. Okay, so I've gone ahead and actually kind of gone ahead and exported the whole scene and started setting things up and prepping for the other episodes. But I'll just show you right now quickly how to get these materials out of Blender into Unreal. I'll export one object right now just to kind of show you. In Unreal, I've got it already set up with all the objects, so I'm just a bit ahead of you. Anyway, so let's just select this one object. We're going to export it. Click on the object and go File, Export, FBX. And in the FBX settings, we just want to make sure we've got selected objects ticked, and we want to go to let's see where we want to go to. Keep all this. This is all fine. We're going to turn off bake animation, and yeah, that's all good. So I'm just going to write. Let's see. I'll just call this hollow table example, and I will click on Export FBX. Now over in Unreal, you can see I've already got the scene set up. So we'll be doing this next episode and then talking about how to get this working. But for right now, I'll go ahead and import that new object. So I'll go to right here, Import Assets. And then you get this little pop-up menu here. When you select the asset, we're just going to click Import All. Again, I know we covered this in the first episode, but I just thought I'd recover it. If you double click on the object that's come in, so you see we've got this hollow table example and hologram V2, which is the material. It's brought both of those in for us. And let's see. So here's the object. You can see it. If you just double click it, it opens it up like this. And then we've got the material. I can double click the material and we can see what it's brought in. So if it doesn't import your texture along with the material, the easiest way to get it is to actually just drag and drop it into your content browser. So just go to your Finder or Explorer and grab the texture file that we saved out of Blender and just drop it in and drag it straight into your material graph. And now we have it in here. Now in the actual object itself, you can actually turn on the UVs. You can see that it's got our UV channel. It's come in nicely. It's also generated another one for the light map. So that's the one that it makes. It always puts it in channel 0, or channel 1, I mean. So let's take this texture and we're going to pipe this into our alpha. But to get an alpha, what you got to do now is we have to actually select the material here. I'll just make this full screen. And in the details panel down here, we can change what type of material this is. So the blend mode right now is set to opaque, and we want to change that to translucent. This little drop-down menu is where you would do all that. So now we get extra options. We get the opacity option. So our textures come in, it's brought it in. You can see it's brought in as linear color. And what we can do now is select really any of these channels, the RGB, because they're all the same, and pipe them right into the opacity. Then remember, our parameter is piped into the base color. We did that just as a reference for ourselves. So what we can do is we can then bring it over and stick it into the emissive color. Now we should also probably turn up the emission a little bit. So I think 4 was what was looking good in Blender. So we'll switch that to 4. All right. And now what we do is we can just click Apply, and that will apply these parameters to this material. So now if we come into our scene and make sure our hollow table is in the scene, we've got our texture working properly. All right. So there we have it. We've got our material now on our object in the scene itself. Now I can also show you real quick how you would actually make a wireframe material for an object if you want. I've got another one here that I made. So you can see this one's actually being generated by Unreal. So if I go into this material, the difference between this one, it's all the same setup, except we're just piping this into our emissive color. And then down here under the options for this material, I've got it set to translucent as we did before. And then there's an extra little option that hides in a drop-down menu right here, okay? And that's just for this particular effect. If you drop this menu down, you get a bunch of other options. And where is it? Wireframe, there it is. So I just tick that box. And boom, we get a wireframe object. So that's a really quick way to just get rid of that. Not have to use a texture for this. Then you do have to duplicate the objects. You need to have like 2 versions of it. So you could bake this material out and then we could like put another one on top and stick that material on it. So that's how that would work. But all right, now we can do the same for our building object as well. And then what we can do is we can try and marry up all of our numbers. So what you want to do is switch over to Blender now. Let's have a look at our little object here. Do we have any other numbers that we've got? Let's just see how our RGB has come across. So with the emission, we've got our RGB set to 0, 12.8298, and this one is 1.19 698. So it's a really big number. If we jump over into Unreal and switch to this material, we can just have a look at what numbers have come across. So our R, G, and B, we've got, let's see, if we set this to 4, that's what we had. You can see it's changed a little bit when we change the vibrancy. So we need to just make sure that those are all the same. So what you can do is you can actually just go in here and click copy for the green channel and paste that one in there. And then we can go over to the, blue channel, copy that one. Come over here, double click that, go to the blue channel, paste that in there. And now, make sure the red's set to 0. Yep. Now it's the same color across the whole thing. If I hit apply and I come back over into Unreal, you'll see that it now looks like it should. So here's the Eevee version, and here's the Unreal version. So they're very, very similar. All right, so now you can do that with all these materials. You can go in here to the door frame material, for example, and open that one up, and then have a look at what are the numbers that we've got. We need to have metallic specular roughness. In Unreal, to get these numbers set correctly, you can't just enter them in like we can in Blender. So you need to use something called a constant. So if I drag out roughness and let go, I can type in constant, and there it is. And a constant is just a straight up number value. One other thing to be aware of is in Unreal, if you want to have a color, like say you don't have the one that came through when we imported the material, you're making a new material and you want to start and have a color itself. You come over here and you add a new node and you type in like color or something. You're gonna get, there's like 1,000 options here, and none of them are just like a straight up color node. So it's really confusing and it can be very frustrating at the start. Whenever you want color, you have to actually go, it's another constant. So if you type in constant, you see we actually get a few different options. The constant's the one we've been using just for a single value, but you have this constant 2 vector, right? Hang on, let me just break this link so I can just show you the different ones. So a constant 2 vector is basically 2 numbers in a single option. And then you've got the constant 3 vector, which is 3 numbers. And we've got the constant 4 vector, you get the idea. Anyways, basically, you have to use one of these to create a color. So you need 3 numbers for R, G, and B to have a color. You need 1 number if you're just using one of these. You would need 4 if you want to have an alpha channel. So R, G, B, and alpha. So that's going to be important. So that's what you have to use. Then you can just double click one of these guys and just pick it, pick a color like normal, and it's no big deal. Plug that into your base color. But yeah, it's just a bit confusing if you don't know to look for it. That's what you want to use for color. So what we need to do is just go through and go back and forth between the two. So I go into my floor, which is my door frame metal material, and have a look at my roughness. That's what I've got it set to. I'll just copy that number, swing back over to here, paste that in, and now I've got the same roughness here as I do in Blender. So we go material by material, copy over all the numbers and update them, and then bring in any textures that we've baked out, link them up, and once we've done all that, then our 2 materials and all the materials in both scenes will match and things will look really good. And the last thing to explain is just with normals, how to do that. So it's very straightforward. So if I go to my room here, I've just updated my mesh. So with the room object selected, if I just go into the material, you can see I've started to set things up a little bit. I've just created some constants for my metallic, specular, and roughness just to match Blender. Don't really need the 0 in the metallic because 0 is the base native position. Anyways, so what you can do is just drag in the normal project file, the little texture that we rendered out into your content browser, and then bring that into your material here. And then unlike Blender, it's actually even more straightforward here. So as soon as we brought it in, it automatically detects what it is, and it sees that it's a normal. So usually you bring this in, and this is where you get like the linear color is where it pops up if it's detected as linear color. In this case, it's just set it to a normal because, hey, it's worked out that this is actually a normal. So all you have to do is take the RGB value of that normal and stick it right into the normal input. Now, of course, you can't just use the red, green, or blue because it needs all 3 color channels to understand what direction things are facing because it's using all that information. So that's why you need to use the RG and B output for the normal as opposed to like, some of these others where we're just using one single channel. So yeah, so there we go. We can see it here on our little sphere object. If we just hit apply and go ahead and save our material as well. If you don't save it, you try and close this out, Unreal will remind you to save it. And now you can see there it is on our scene. Now it looks a little bit different from Blender. You can see we're a bit more reflective here, like the specs a bit glossier, but that's because we haven't brought all of the colors, all of the lights really into our scene yet in the way that they are over in Blender. So we just need to marry that up. If you've got any nodes that are plugged directly in, so over in Blender here, if we've got, got a node like this system here, we've got our room normal texture. If I was to just plug this straight into the normal, bypass this whole crazy system, then when we export an object, an FBX with an object in it that's got this material assigned to it, if I bring that into Unreal, it's actually going to bring this texture along with it because it sees that this is plugged into the normal. If you had a texture plugged into anywhere, it's going to do it. If you have it plugged into nodes first, and then those nodes are plugged in, like in this case, it won't actually bring this texture in. It'll just ignore this whole system. So that's just something else. You could speed up your workflow a little bit, is if you have your textures already plugged in just directly to your node graph, you bring that in, it's going to import all those for you automatically, but not that big of a deal. Anyways, worth knowing. Let me talk about a couple of objects. Now I've got a couple of problems in this scene that I want to fix here so I can show you how to fix them. So the first one here is I noticed that the material on my table isn't looking quite right. So I've got this like, it's not consistent, the noise pattern on it. And I can tell that this isn't the texture I've baked out. So I want to figure out what's going on. So you can see that what's come in, we've got 3 UV channels. And that's because I ended up going with a UV channel. I made a separate UV channel for just the bit that has the hollow table metal is what I ended up calling it, the base material with the noise. Anyway, so, and then we can see that Unreal has created a light map for us from these UVs. So that's the light map that it's created. Not a very good one, so that's all right. Okay, so I'm just gonna close that out. So what I think is going on with this is that it's using the wrong UV. So how do you fix that? So I'm gonna go down to the hollow table metal material and I'll double click it. And here we are in the material itself. And I've done a few things in here, but I'll explain those in a minute. So if I take, I'll just fix this. I'll just plug that straight in. So this is the texture that I exported. So I did that technique that I talked about where, so the red channel has the metallic number, the green channel has the specular number, and the blue channel has the roughness number. So to know what UV this thing's using, you can click on the texture sample. And over here you get details. The details change for whatever it is you have selected. So I've got this selected and it says here under constant coordinate, only used if coordinate is not hooked up. So what's a coordinate? Well, if you hover over UV, defaults to constant coordinate if not specified. This is what it's talking about, the UV. So if you don't specify which UV to use, it's going to default to whatever number is set here. So the coordinate number here is number 2, and that's not the right UV. So which UV do we want to use? Well, I want to use either 0 or 1. Those are the correct UVs. Both of those will work fine. So let's go with 0 because it just makes sense. So I'll go back over to hollow base metal and I'll just set the constant coordinate from my texture sample to 0. And I'll just hit apply and just give it a second to think about that. And then I can close this out and it's going to go back to the checker pattern and then boom, there we go. It's applied correctly. And now it looks good. Now I felt that the material was just a bit too harsh. The noise that I baked out, I didn't actually test this very well in Blender. I kind of just went with a noise pattern and baked it out. So I thought I'd use this as a chance just to show you how you might adjust some values directly within Unreal. So again, I'm going to open up my hollow table metal and down here, I've got a little system that I've set up. So I've taken my blue channel, which is the roughness that I want to back off a little bit. And what I've done is I've decided, okay, you know what? I want to back it all off. I'm going to reduce the intensity of it by about half. So I've multiplied it. So I just created a multiply node. So it's not like a math node where you can select the type of operation you want. You actually have to specify it in the node itself. So I'm going to go for a multiply node here. And then I got a constant again, just like we use for, we're piping in numbers here. And I put that to 0.5. So I'm multiplying this value by 0.5. So it's basically reducing the size of all these numbers by half. That's going to get it all closer to 0, right? It's going to darken everything down. So a 1 is now going to be 0.5. So I'm never going to have a fully rough section of this material. It's always going to be, between 0 and 0.5. So then I wanted to kind of boost it up a bit once I reduced it all down. So I created an add node. Again, a math operation, and I've added 0.1 to it. And then I put it through a clamp just to be safe that I wasn't going to go beyond 0 or 1. I wanted to keep it in 0 and 1. So again, this is just another node. You just right click and type in clamp, and there it is, math clamp. And you could specify what you want to clamp it between. And then I plugged that into my roughness. So it's pretty logical, and it's similar logic to what you would do in Blender, but you can see they're just different nodes. They're slightly different. Clamp's the same, but instead of a math node, you need to specify, add, multiply, whatever it is. So that's just a really good thing to be aware of. And that's how you can kind of work and do these sort of operations. And I got to these values, this 0.1 and 0.5, just by guessing and applying and having a look at it in the scene and then changing them. All right, so that covers changing the UV channels and how to affect some of the values. But what happens when a texture comes in that's the wrong type of material? So let me go to my room here. So again, hollow table, VR static mesh room, and I'm going to go to the material that's on my room. All right, so so this is, I'm using a normal texture here, a normal map here. Now let me plug it straight into my normal. All right, and I'll hit apply, and I'll move this window out of the way. And we'll have a look at what this looks like. Oh, that's ugly. So you see it's like super staticky. What's going on? Well, first off, we don't have aliasing turned on. The aliasing is when software blends pixels to kind of soften things. It's a great technique in games that creates soft edges, so you don't get aliasing. Aliasing is the jaggy edges that you're seeing, like on the edge of the table. And when you have lots of detail like this in a noise texture, it turns out looking like static, right? So to fix this, what I wanted to do is actually back off the intensity of this normal map. So the map out of Blender, it works because Blender's applying a lot of aliasing and stuff to the scene. We don't have any turned on here. Now we can turn aliasing on, and we will, but just as a point, you can also adjust how intense that normal map is. Because in Blender, we've got the strength of our normals we can change. So I wanted to use the flatten normal node. The flatten normal node does basically what it says. It flattens the normals between a value of, I've plugged in a constant into the flatness number here. So if I go 1, it's going to get rid of all the bump, all the normals. So it's not going to have any texture whatsoever. If I go to 0, it's going to be the full value, which is what we're looking at when we plug it straight in. So I went with 0.8. So I've almost got rid of all of it. And I found that ended up looking really nice. So I plugged that back in, click apply. You can see the effect here, and boom, that's much nicer. So that's how we can flatten out normals. All right, so now what happens if you bring in a texture and it's the wrong type? I know I just said that and did something totally different. So I imported my texture for the hose. So I baked out my hose normal from Blender, just like we would do, just like I talked about earlier. And now, when I've imported it, so I forgot to change, in Blender, I forgot to change the settings. So when I was doing my hose, and I created my material, my image material, or my image file to bake out my material, I forgot to set it to non-color. I actually had it set to linear color, right? And because of that, over in Unreal, it's come through and it's going, oh, this is a linear color image. And I'm going, actually, no, it's not. So it's trying to use a linear color image for normals. It's not going to work in the right way. You're going to get weird results and things aren't going to be quite right. I could just show you. So if you switch it here, so if you click on the texture sample, you get the sampler type as one of the options, and you can switch it to all the different types. And so what you can do is you can switch it to say, okay, this is going to be a normal, but it's going to give you this error. It's going to say it's not a normal. It should be linear color because that's what's baked into this file type. That's how it's interpreting it. So in order to change that, what we can do is we can double click here to get the actual texture window. You could also get to this if you select the material, or you can just double click on the actual file here as well. You get this window. And right at the top, we got compression settings. There's a ton of settings you can tweak with everything in Unreal, but this compression settings is basically, this is how it's going to compress the file when you package your project. And this is where you set what it actually is on a deep fundamental level. So it's defaulted here to this default, which is going to be the linear color. And I just want to change it to normal map. So I'm saying, no, it's a normal map. Save that. And now if I go back over to my material and I set it to normal, there you go. So now it's not giving me that error anymore and it's all working fine. And I'm getting, that's a much better result now. It's much stronger. So those are some of the things that you'll run into, some of the gotchas that are really helpful to be aware of. The other thing is I've brightened up all of my emissions. So for example, the outside light, the little plane that we have outside there, it came in and the parameter was set to a value of, actually the brightness was set to like 0.8. It was 0.8, 0.8, 0.8, 0.8. And I just went to vibrancy and I just typed the number 10 to bump it way up high. And what that's done now is it's actually
really, really brightened it up. So now if I put bloom on in my scene, it's really going to bloom out and glow. So I've done that with all of my lights as well, the buttons and stuff. I've turned them on and I've set them to 2 or to 3 or 4 or 5, just till I get a brightness that I think is really good. Okay, so that's all the stuff about importing and some of the different things that you want to do to just make sure that things are looking good in between the two pieces of software. Now, what I find is over here in Blender, if I've got if I'm set to Eevee, I'm going to turn to rendered mode. If my color settings down at the bottom under color management, if I set my display device to sRGB, which is correct because I'm looking at an sRGB monitor, and you probably are too because that's the standard for computers. My view transport is set to filmic, and that's going to give me a certain look to the view. You could change this to get different looks in your scene. And that's just for rendering purposes. But and I've got my look set to none. I find that, and exposure is 1 and gamma is 2, as it was 1 as well. So I find that this setting here, these settings match Unreal the best in my opinion. Now the scenes don't look the same, and that's because I've actually tweaked my lighting a bit differently over here. But if I tried to match my lighting spot on, I would actually get a very, very similar looking result. The important thing is all the materials and stuff are coming through correctly and things are looking good there. So again, I hope you've really enjoyed this episode. I hope you've learned a lot about how you can bake out materials and then bring them over into Unreal and link them up to get them working. And I hope this has really been really helpful for you and that you've learned a lot. So once again, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate everybody checking these videos out and putting their comments in the comment section. And it's just awesome. All the feedback's been really great. So please hit that like button. If you like this video, I want to see more like it. I'm going to keep making them. And please subscribe. Please subscribe so that you can get notifications. Ring that little bell. The notification window will pop up when a new one launches. I'm trying to premiere these every Wednesday and be there. I'll see you when the next video launches. Have a great week, and I will catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.